Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carla Freeman. I'm the director of the Foreign Policy Institute here at SAIS. My research and teaching here at SAIS is on China and Chinese foreign policy. I'm so glad to see you all here today for a discussion about diplomacy. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's Dean's Forum and Foreign Policy Institute program, the first installment of our Arts of Diplomacy series. The Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS was founded in 1980, building on an earlier institute established here at SAIS by Paul Nitze to bridge the worlds of scholarship and policy. As a long-standing conduit for policy research at SAIS and an incubator of new ideas to help SAIS continue to educate the most extraordinary leaders in international affairs, the Foreign Policy Institute brings the experience of seasoned policymakers, non-governmental organization leaders, and journalists to engage with students and faculty here at SAIS. The Art of Diplomacy series is organized to help the SAIS community think about the meaning and use of diplomacy to achieve America's international goals. Today, we look forward to exploring how diplomacy furthers U.S. foreign policy goals around the world in today's rapidly changing international environment. What types of diplomacy are there? What tools are being utilized by the United States today? What tools aren't being used, and what should be used? What does smart diplomacy mean? How are the concepts of credibility and diplomacy related? These are some of the questions that prompted us to convene today's discussion. We have two very distinguished figures here today who will explore these questions with us. Both are leaders here in the SAIS community, leaders in the foreign policy arena, and both are leaders at the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. Our Dean and Foreign Policy Institute Chair, Vali Nasr, is known to us all. Thank you, Vali. And we're delighted to have Tony Blinken as our Herder Nitze Distinguished Scholar at the Foreign Policy here at SAIS to share his views today. Thank you. Let me begin by introducing Dean Nasr to those of you who do not know his work prior to joining us here at SAIS. Before Dean Nasr took on the task of remaking SAIS for the 21st century, he spent much of his distinguished career as a Middle East scholar, writing numerous books, including Forces of Fortune, The Shia Revival, and most recently, The Dispensable Nation. After receiving his doctorate at MIT, much of his academic career was focused at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. However, Dean Nasr also served for a number of years tackling some of the most difficult challenges in foreign policy on Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department, where he served as special advisor to the President's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke. Thank you again, Vali. Vali will lead the conversation with Tony Blinken. As I mentioned, Mr. Blinken is the Herder Nitze Distinguished Scholar at the Foreign Policy Institute. After getting a law degree from Columbia University, he practiced law in New York and in Paris, and then began a very distinguished career in government, holding senior foreign policy positions in two U.S. administrations over 3 decades, including most recently Deputy Secretary of State, the nation's #2 diplomat. As Deputy Secretary, he traveled to 40 countries, helping to lead diplomacy in the fight against ISIL, the rebalance to Asia, and the global refugee crisis. Among his other accomplishments at the State Department, he built bridges to the innovation community, including establishing a full-time State Department presence in Silicon Valley and initiating the State Department's Innovation Forum, which enlists innovators and technologists in solving complex foreign policy problems. Before I turn the mic over to the discussion today, I wanted to make 2 quick remarks. First, my younger colleagues at the Foreign Policy Institute remind me that social media can be a tool of diplomacy. Indeed, it's even used by presidents. So if members of the audience want to share insights drawn from our discussion today, we invite you to live tweet using the hashtag FPI Convos, and also to follow the FPI and our speakers. Our Twitter handle and those of Dean Nasr and Mr. Blinken are displayed up here on the screens. Finally, as I mentioned, this is our first program of the new academic year. And before we get started, I wanted to both acknowledge and express our sadness on the loss late last spring of former SAIS faculty member and Foreign Policy Institute fellow Zbigniew Brzezinski. Dr. Brzezinski taught at SAIS actually when I was a student here and retained an affiliation and an office here at SAIS in the Foreign Policy Institute until his death. We had been planning his fall lectures when we last were in touch with him. So I thought I'd invoke his advice to America about leadership and diplomacy to start off our event this evening. Brzezinski wrote in Foreign Affairs a few years ago that Americans must place greater emphasis on the more subtle dimensions of national power, such as innovation, education, the balance of force and diplomacy, and the quality of political leadership. To that I say, hear, hear. Let me turn the discussion over to our two speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla, for that generous introduction. And it's wonderful to start this new year, a new academic year, and also this series with Tony Blinken, who joined SAIS after he left the administration, and as our Nitsa Herter, distinguished scholar at the Foreign Policy Institute, and has been very engaged with our students and our various programs in terms of preparing them for particularly the very challenging time period that we're engaged in. Tony, as Carla mentioned, has had a very distinguished career in foreign service and national security, in particular working with Foreign Relations Committee at the Senate, with then Senator Biden, and then at the White House as Foreign Policy and National Security Advisor to the Vice President, and then as Assistant to the President on Foreign Policy and National Security Affairs, and then as the Deputy Secretary of State. So I cannot think of anyone currently in the panoply of people who've been in the previous administration who has had a better front row seat in seeing how the current crises that we're seeing in the world today, how did they unfold, how were they managed, and what are the critical issues that we need to deal with. And also as a practitioner, he has a great deal of insight in terms of how they ought to be tackled. And he also writes routinely for New York Times, and some of you have seen his opinions on the issues that we're grappling with. So thinking about what I should talk to Tony, I found out that it's pages and pages, given how many sets of crises, domestic and international, that we're dealing with, and that I guess it's sort of unprecedented in many ways. But a number of these are ones that Tony has worked on, and I wanted to start actually with the one that is very much on the forefront of our thinking today, which is North Korea. Which is an issue that you also dealt with and saw this evolve. You saw the succession from father to the son, his early consolidation of power. So to begin with, if you were sitting at the White House and you looked at these sets of provocations and knew all of a sudden policy initiatives coming out of Pyongyang, how should the United States, or say the president, actually interpret these challenges and then put it in the right perspective for us?
Yeah. Well, Vali, thank you. And Carla, thank you for your wonderful introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. Let me just say at the outset how grateful I am to be part of this community. And I'm so grateful that SAIS did not bar refugees coming in this case from the last administration. And it's wonderful to feel so welcome here. If I were sitting at the White House looking at the North Korea problem, the first thing I'd probably do is get up and find another job, because it is, to be very fair to this administration, as Samantha Power said in a very different context, a problem from hell. And I think we have to start with the proposition that successive administrations, going back arguably to Bush 41, have grappled with this problem, and with a couple of exceptions, failed to stop the march of North Korea toward the nuclear arsenal that it has and the missile program that it has. There was a brief period in the 1990s under the agreed framework agreement that the Clinton administration negotiated, where the plutonium program was stopped, and stopped for about 6 years. But then it turned out the North Koreans had a surreptitious uranium program. The Bush administration that came in took a different approach, and the relentless march forward continued. I think, Vali, where we are now and is in a very difficult place for a couple of reasons. First, what happened about a year and a half ago is that North Korea really pressed the accelerator on trying to develop the capability of having an ICBM with a nuclear warhead that could actually reach the United States. And during the last administration, we of course saw that. And that was a proposition that we found unacceptable. It was bad enough that North Korea developed this arsenal and had a whole panoply of short-range and intermediate-range missiles. The idea that the technology of an ICBM with a nuclear warhead in the hands of a leader who at best seems to act impulsively, and some people believe irrationally, is not something any American administration would be comfortable with. So we began to push very, very hard on a number of fronts, starting with China, which really is the decisive player in this drama, to see if we could get the North Koreans back to the table. We looked, of course, at every option, and just as I imagine the Trump administration has. And of course, we looked at military options. You have to. But the conclusion that we reached is that there is simply not a good preemptive military option when it comes to North Korea. The problem is that the program it has is buried under mountains and underground. Much of it is hidden. Increasingly, they have developed mobile missiles that can be hidden, wheeled out in a matter of minutes, and fueled with a solid propellant that takes an hour, not days, to fuel. And then even if we could have perfect knowledge of where everything was and we could hit it, as many of you know, their capacity to launch a retaliatory conventional strike on Seoul with thousands of pieces of artillery, rockets, poised 25 or 30 miles from the South Korean capital is such that the likely result would be tens of thousands, if not more, civilian casualties in any attempt to take out their program preemptively. So that doesn't look like a good option. Now, of course, if you saw North Korea putting an ICBM on a launch pad with a nuclear warhead on it, you'd be able to do something about that. But the idea that we can act first to take out the entire program, I think, is a path that doesn't really lead anywhere good. So that leaves one thing, and that's to get to some kind of negotiation. The question is, how do you do it? And I think it ultimately comes down, if it's still possible, to some mixture of pressure and coercion, but also, the flip side, a clear openness to actually negotiating something and resolving this issue, the nuclear challenge posed by North Korea, diplomatically. The pressure piece, very quickly. As I said, China remains the linchpin. 90% of North Korea's trade is through with China. So China has a unique capacity to leverage North Korea. China says that its influence with North Korea has declined. That's probably true. But leverage is different than influence. It retains the leverage. But of course, China is deeply concerned, and understandably concerned, about precipitating a crisis that leads to millions of North Korean refugees heading into China, and of course, losing the strategic buffer that it has with North Korea between itself and South Korea, and in effect us. So, with China, what we started to do was to say very clearly to them, we want to work this cooperatively with you. And we need, ideally, to work cooperatively with China. But if you can't, or you won't, there are steps that we, the United States, are going to have to take to protect our interests and those of our partners and allies. More missile defense, more exercises, military exercises with South Korea and Japan. Sanctions, including, if necessary, secondary sanctions on companies or entities and individuals, including Chinese companies and individuals that are doing business with North Korea. None of this aimed at China, but none of it that China would like. To create a greater incentive for China to basically get off the fence, which is where it's been. It's tried to have it both ways, doing just enough to keep us grudgingly happy, but not doing so much that it risks going tilt with North Korea. So that's one piece. Piece two on this pressure effort to get North Korea's attention is to systematically, comprehensively, sustainably go around the world and work to sever every economic, diplomatic, political, and military tie that the DPRK has. And that's exactly what we started to do about a little over a year ago, and with some significant success. As many of you know, there are tens of thousands of North Korean guest workers in countries around the world. By some accounts, the remittances that they send back home, not to their families, alas, but to the government, exceed $1 billion a year. We work to cut those off, to stop their ships from docking, to stop Air Koryo from landing, to stop their diplomats from engaging in illicit commercial enterprises. If you do that comprehensively, sustainably, deliberately, and we did, in very close coordination with South Korea and Japan, over time, if China plays the game too, you can have an effect. Now, the problem is this: whereas the father and grandfather seemed to see the nuclear and missile program as a bargaining chip that they were willing to use to negotiate, Kim Jong-un seems to see it as his only insurance policy against regime change. And that is not crazy, seen from his perspective. When he looks at what happened to Gaddafi in Libya after Gaddafi gave up his weapons, that's it would be hard not to conclude that he might be in danger. Even if he looks at Saddam Hussein, who actually was complying with UN inspections and nonetheless was removed, that's a conclusion that you could reach. So from Kim's perspective, the price has to be very, very, very high to be willing to come to the table. And I think if that price is denying him effectively the resources he needs to keep funding his program and to keep paying off elites, there's a chance that he would come to the table, not to negotiate giving up his weapons. That will not happen anytime soon, I don't think, but at least to freeze what he's doing. And that would be beneficial to us, because every time he tests, he perfects the technology to actually have an effective ICBM with a nuclear warhead that can reach the United States. If you stop the testing, you can stop the forward progress of that program. And then you buy time. And in time, things happen. And maybe a negotiation goes somewhere deeper. Maybe other things happen. And in diplomacy, sometimes that's the best thing. So if I were there, that's what I'd be doing. One final piece, Vali, to this. You have to do two things. You have to be in absolute solidarity with your allies and partners, starting with South Korea. They're affected even more immediately than we are. And so anything that disrupts that, including criticizing your partner, South Korea, in the midst of a crisis, is not a good idea. Second, you have to be very clear with China that we really do want a diplomatic resolution, that we are not out for regime change. And their rhetoric that lowers the bar on military action is not likely to send the right message to China. It's also not going to send the right message to Kim Jong-un. In his own paranoia, the more the bar is lowered to military action, rhetorically, from the United States, the greater the likelihood that he misinterprets something we do, not as a discrete, cabined move, for example, flying planes, B-1 bombers, over the peninsula, but the beginning of an attack to change his regime. And in that case, he might just cash in that nuclear insurance policy in ways that would be terrible. So you have to do that. And finally, we have to engage the Chinese on a conversation about the future. The only way they are going to be willing to take even greater risks at precipitating a crisis is if they have some greater confidence that the end result, including the end result of reunification, would not fundamentally damage their interests. And so where would we go? Where would our forces go? Where would South Korea go? Who would go to control the nuclear sites? All of that, ideally, needs to be discussed with the Chinese. In fairness, we've tried to have these conversations. They've not been eager to have them. But if I were in China's shoes, I'd be very worried that, the regime could change any time. I don't think that's likely, but it's certainly possible. And if we're not collectively prepared for it, we're all going to have an even bigger problem.
Actually, very interesting. So when you talk about the diplomatic track to contain North Korea, so there is a sort of a lower level diplomatic track, which is working with all the countries to stop their planes, ships, banking, et cetera, which seems to have been successful, and it's on a roll, and the U.S. Treasury can play an important role. And then there's a sort of a macro level, higher level diplomacy, which is to talk about an end game with the Chinese, about how does this actually finish, not how we sort of put a cap on it. And I'm actually intrigued by the fact that you say that the Chinese are not eager to have this conversation. Often the impression is that we actually have not initiated this conversation directly. But so one key issue becomes that if you were advising the president about, or the Secretary of State in sort of your old capacity as Deputy Secretary, is that how does one convene that sort of macro level discussion, and whether it should be bilateral between China and the U.S., should it be multilateral, and sort of, let me put it this way. One of the things that actually is very intriguing to me is actually right now absence of any kind of a U.S. diplomatic effort. I mean, nobody's on an airplane, shuttle diplomacy in the region. The secretary, there's no deputy secretary.
Actually, there is.
Well, there is, okay.
And a very good guy.
Very good, but
John Sullivan.
you don't see them, in Seoul, in Tokyo, in Beijing, on an ongoing basis, try to sort of gin up something. But I'm curious about whether this crisis has reached a level that really now requires a concerted sort of endgame strategy, and as a diplomat, how one should also really think about this. So that's one thing I want to sort of ask. The other is, I was very intrigued by the description you had about what is actually possible with North Korea is just to get them to stop, and that buys time and at least slows their progress. And if you listen very carefully, that sounds like the Iran deal, which raised an interesting issue about wanting now to say it's a bad deal, let's decertify this one, but by the way, we want exactly the same one over there.
Right.
But it might also raise sort of interesting questions that if you were to revisit the Iran deal, what are the lessons learned, and why were we successful actually to getting Iran to accept exactly what we're hoping North Korea accept? And if there were things that we left at the table that we shouldn't have, what are things that we ought to think about as we approach this with North Korea?
So, Vali, first on the diplomacy, I've certainly not been shy about being critical of this administration, but in fairness, I think there are conversations that are going on very quietly. Yang Jiechi was just in the United States, the state counselor. And I suspect,
China.
Yes, of China. I suspect his brief was to talk exactly about this. We did bring the Chinese along now, this administration, on 2 strong UN Security Council resolutions. There were 2 of them in the last year of Obama that were the strongest to date. These have added to those resolutions. Not as far as we'd like to go, but still, I think actually good diplomacy in getting those resolutions done. Ambassador Haley worked hard on that, deserves credit for that. So I think there are conversations going on. They're just not very open, public, and that's fine. But I hope the conversations are comprehensive, and we can draw out the Chinese on really thinking, not just as you said about right now, but about where this actually goes. And part of that, though, the very first piece of this has to be making sure that when it comes to thinking about the future, we are in lockstep with our partners before we hopefully get in some kind of lockstep with China. That is, there has to be no daylight between us and South Korea on what the future of the peninsula would look like. Unless and until that's very clear, it's hard to go try to cut a deal with China. So I would hope that they're locking all of that in. There's been a process in place for some time where we've had these very detailed conversations with South Korea. But there's some things that still need clarification, and I would hope that's being done. I could not agree with you more, Vali, on the Iran deal. Now, 2 things. The parallels, of course, are not exact. In the case of Iran, we're dealing with a country that had not developed nuclear weapons. In the case of North Korea, they've already got them, and unfortunately, quite a number of them. So you're locking in a status quo in Iran, a pre-nuclear weapon status quo. You would be locking in, unfortunately, a post-nuclear weapon status quo with North Korea. I think it's still a valuable thing to do. But you're also 100% right that the idea that we would decertify the Iran deal, despite the fact that Iran is in compliance with that agreement, that would basically take whatever small prospect there is of some kind of negotiation with North Korea, take it and throw it in the trash can. Because when you're already dealing with someone like Kim Jong-un, who is highly suspicious, to understate our motives, and as we said a moment ago, is looking at Libya, looking at Iraq. If we then take a deal that was negotiated in public, in good faith, with other countries coming in, and the United States signing its name to it, and then we throw that out the window, why in the world would Kim Jong-un ever get into any kind of negotiation with us? So I think decertifying Iran would almost guarantee that there are 0 prospects for having some kind of reasonable diplomatic, if not resolution, at least way station with the DPRK.
Interesting. So now, The other sort of big issue that confronts the administration, which is the issue of Russia, which is sort of multidimensional. But this, I mean, there's a domestic part to it, but which actually has overshadowed the fact that all of the issues that we dealt with Russia were sort of a menace during the Obama administration are still there, namely Ukraine, Syria, and now obviously you can add to it the overall issue of cyber and interference in European politics and the like. So, you know, first of all, you know, I guess the interesting question, or even a public question in the U.S. is you know, why did the Obama administration find Russian behavior problematic, and where was the origins of the drift? And I would assume, I guess that's central to understanding whether or not the current Trump approach with Russia actually is feasible. It'll work if you went beyond just personalities that, you know, Obama and Putin didn't like each other, and Trump and Putin like each other. But I mean, what sort of structural issues you saw with Russia that we ought to sort of think as permanent beyond what the hopes and aspirations of this administration are?
So when the Obama administration came in, many of you will remember, we actually tried to push the so-called reset button on relations with Russia. We thought they had reached a low point in the preceding years, and that there were certainly room for improvement and reasons for improvement in terms of the self-interest of both countries. So we worked hard at that, and there were good results initially, including a new strategic arms limitation treaty, New START, including cooperation on Afghanistan, where Russian forbearance made it a little bit easier for us to move troops and materiel in and out. Good work on getting Russia into the World Trade Organization, and a number of other things that were positive. And then things went very, very badly off track, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. And one of them, in a sense, really is structural, and that is, despite the progress we'd made in some areas where we'd had some mutual self-interest, my own sense is that we've kind of been talking past each other since the end of the Cold War. We believed in the United States, through successive administrations, that we were working in good faith to try to bring Russia into the international system, to integrate it. And we wanted Russia to succeed. We thought a failing Russia would be a lot worse than a successful one. Seen from Moscow, of course, that's not how it looked. First, there was the humiliation of losing the empire. But beyond that, through NATO enlargement, for example, which I very much supported and continue to support, nonetheless, seen through Russian eyes, that looked like an effort to contain and encircle Russia. And there was kind of a dialogue of the deaf going on, as we thought we were talking to each other, but we really weren't. And then meanwhile, in Russia itself, capitalism had been fully unleashed, but without any of the controls and checks and balances to make sure that it worked in some kind of relatively equitable way. Some people got extraordinarily enriched. Many others, of course, did not. And that fueled, I think, a bit of a crisis of legitimacy for this new system that was coming in. And all of these things were developing over time. But fundamentally, all of that said, I still believe that ultimately President Putin is largely responsible for the demise in the relationship. Seen from his perspective, again, he saw NATO enlargement as a threat to Russia in an effort to keep it down, and then a succession of color revolutions in countries around Russia where he saw the hidden hand of the United States. Of course, in Georgia, in Ukraine, and then after his own election, when massive protests erupted over the corruption and illegitimacy of the election, and then Secretary Clinton said some things publicly in support of those who were making their voices heard, he, I think, genuinely believed that we were behind the protests, not the actual beliefs and feelings of the Russian people who were protesting. So things really started to spiral in a downward direction. Then we had a couple of incidents, notably Snowden, that really started to spiral things even worse. And then, of course, Russia's intervention in Ukraine, where there, too, there was probably some talking past each other. We thought after the government was pushed out with the disruption on the Maidan that we had struck a deal to keep the president in place for some time, to get to elections, and we had avoided having a horrific civil war in Ukraine. The president then, of course, fled. Actually, it's kind of, it's a funny, well, it's not so funny in retrospect, but the very day that he fled, Vice President Biden was supposed to talk to him on the phone. They had a call scheduled. We thought we had gotten a deal in place to have the crisis abate and, again, get to an election in about 6 months, as I recall. And the president was nowhere to be found. And that was the day that he actually fled. The Russians thought we had pushed him out. That was not at all what we did. They then basically invented a reverse Maidan, first by going into Crimea and then by ginning up a lot of trouble in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And we had that crisis, which of course defined the relationship going forward. This was profoundly problematic to us for this reason. You know, you can look at the Ukraine crisis and say, why should the United States care about it? Ukraine is far away. It's not the most important partner that we have in the world in terms of trade or the military relationship. Why do we care? And I think the reason is we care because what Russia did in Ukraine goes way beyond even Ukraine itself in its implications and possible repercussions. What Russia did was to violate some very basic principles that we've tried to establish since the end of the Cold War and even arguably since the end of the Second World War. And that is that another country doesn't go in to a neighbor and forcibly change its borders. Another country does not dictate to the people of a neighbor their choices about their own future, including with whom they will associate or ally, all of which Russia was trying to do. If you let that stand, if you let those principles be violated, then it is open season. So this was a matter of profound principle for us, not just the relationship with Ukraine. Final thing I'd say is, look, seen from here and seen from now, Mr. Putin has played a arguably weak hand very, very, very well. He's managed to use our own openness against us in terms of intervening in our elections, doing the same thing in Europe. He's infiltrated political parties in Europe, infiltrated the media, and all of that openness gets turned against us. And at the same time, of course, he's acted with tactical strength in Ukraine, in Syria. Now, my own view is that while he's successful tactically as a strategic proposition, at some point the chickens come home to roost. In Ukraine, arguably, he has precipitated, in some ways, exactly what he was trying to prevent. Russian influence in 90% of Ukraine is lost for generations. The Russians are hated in most of Ukraine. NATO, which Russia feared the most, as a result of the intervention in Ukraine, is more energized than it's been at any time in the last decade. And there are now more NATO forces more regularly closer to Russia than at any time in recent history. Europeans are arguably a little bit more serious about energy security than they've been as a result of Ukraine. And finally, the economic sanctions that the United States took a lead role in organizing and sustaining have done real damage to Russia's prospects going forward. Of course, the fall in oil prices was primarily what hit them, but the sanctions were very well designed, particularly to go after denying Russia the technology it would need, for example, to exploit more difficult to get energy going forward. That continues to have an impact. So I think it's hugely frustrating because I really do think there was goodwill on the American side about the relationship, a desire to make it work. Maybe we didn't understand well enough the Russian perspective. But the problem now, and I think the problem confronting any administration, is to understand whether the nature of the relationship is really being defined by Mr. Putin, and when at some point in the future maybe the actuarial tables play and he goes away, will we have a different relationship, or is this a reflection of something much more profound?
But sitting at this juncture, dealing with the Russia that we're confronting and at least a set of challenges that we think it's putting before us, what is the best strategy for an American administration in terms of containing and checking Russian policy?
I think you have to be very deliberate and very clear about what you're doing. If Russia tries to interfere in other countries, we will stand up against it and we will support those countries in any way that we can. It may be military, it may be economic, as in the case of Ukraine. It may be political and diplomatic. And we need to be very clear that we'll do that. Second, I think we should nonetheless, in doing that, continue to see, one, if there are ways to diffuse some of these problems, particularly Ukraine, where we repeatedly offered Russia off-ramps that Mr. Putin decided not to take, but I think it's still worth pursuing that. It's a very good diplomat now, Kurt Volker, who's in charge of the Ukraine file for the administration. My hope is that he'll make some headway in working with Russians, although ultimately it's really up to President Trump, because Putin is the sole decider in Russia, and while diplomats can make progress engaging with each other, ultimately it has to be the president, to the president, to make that work. But we need to look for ways to continue to diffuse these crises, and then hopefully, if that can happen, and if we can get back to some semblance of business as usual, then maybe we can look at areas of cooperation. Syria, of course, is the other big outlier, and that's the subject of a whole other conversation.
So I want to switch to the Iran deal, but you know, maybe in terms of understanding the way American foreign policy and diplomacy works, sort of take advantage of your other experience in Congress, because this, unlike the other sets of issues we've talked about, Congress is maybe a bigger sort of proactive, active player. And you know, maybe both in terms of when the deal was originally signed, you know, how did you see the role of the Congress then? And then potentially, at least, you know, listening, for instance, to Ambassador Haley, one can think of the decertification of Iran as a sort of a version of the DACA approach. In other words, that the administration can just hand this over to Congress and let them certify or not certify Iran and be done with it. And if that actually happens, that the administration basically says, you know, we're not certifying, Congress has an option, as 6 months, just like DACA, to decide what do they want to do with the deal. How would this play out in Congress? And this idea that Congress can basically take charge of a major foreign policy arena with possibility of having major impact, how would this play out?
Well, it's a great question, and you know, there's a certain amount of irony here, because of course, when we were negotiating the agreement with Iran, Congress, to the extent you can talk about Congress collectively, certainly a lot of the leadership was very insistent in having some kind of, certainly a voice and ideally a vote on the agreement. And they certainly got a voice, but they didn't get really effectively a vote on it. And they were unhappy about that. And I know from having sat in Congress, I can understand that. But that was the way it played out. I think the irony now, Vali, is that I suspect that about the last thing Congress wants, including many who oppose the deal, is to have it put back in their laps right now. Why? Because the deal's working. And if the plug were to be pulled on the deal, it would have all sorts of negative consequences for the United States around the world that Congress doesn't want to be carrying on its shoulder. In the first instance, if the United States were seen as being responsible for the demise of the agreement without justification, that is, Iranian noncompliance, and the Iranians are complying with the agreement. Don't take my word for it. The IAEA has repeatedly certified it. Our own intelligence community has also verified it. If we were to decertify, or if Congress was given that hot potato and forced to act on it, one, our partners in the agreement would not go along with us. They would continue to do business with Iran. And Iran would have the best of both worlds, where arguably some of the constraints would be gone. It would still have the benefit of doing business with other countries. And we would be isolated, not Iran. Now, we could choose to try to pressure our partners into pulling the plug on their economic relationship with Iran. But I've seen that movie before, and it doesn't usually end well. We tried to do this in the 1990s. We tried to do this again in the 2000s. including by imposing some extraterritorial sanctions on companies and countries investing in Iran's energy sector. The Europeans rebelled against that, took us to the WTO, and we almost had a crisis within the alliance. So I don't think that plays out very well for us. At the same time, as we were talking about earlier, I think it has very bad repercussions for any prospect of a diplomatic resolution to the nuclear standoff with North Korea. And then more broadly, this message that it sends, that the United States is not good for its word, that you can negotiate something with the United States, do what you're supposed to do, and nonetheless have the rug pulled out from under you, that sends a terrible message to any country, anywhere, that we would be trying to negotiate with. And again, I don't think Congress really wants that on its back either. So, oh, and there's one final element. Of course, Israel, at the time we negotiated the deal, was among its most vociferous public critics, starting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, if you ask virtually any Israeli military leader or intelligence official whether we should stay in or get out, it's unanimous, it's stay in. This deal, from the perspective of Israel, has at the very least put off, well into the future, a big problem that they just as soon not face given everything else that they have going on. So the Israelis don't want us to get out, and I'm sure they'll make that known to Congress too. Now, there are all sorts of ideas that somehow we could renegotiate things, that we negotiated a bad deal, and I'm certainly happy to talk about that till the cows come home. There is a fantasy that there's really a better deal to be had. Phil Gordon wrote very eloquently about this a few days ago, I think, in the Washington Post.
Right. Actually, I was, when Ambassador Haley, in her comments about the deal, said disparagingly that this deal was designed to make it unattractive to leave, that's actually the definition of a good deal. So, now, before we go to the audience, I wanted to ask you one find about your impressions about at this juncture, particularly about the importance of diplomacy. And where do you see it in balance currently in American foreign policy? And I wanted, if you could tie it into at least the perception that we have outside from what's happening to the State Department. I mean, you were Deputy Secretary of State, the #2 person in that department. The impression we have, and actually our Professor Elliot Cohen just wrote in The Atlantic, that it's being literally eviscerated with departures and job cuts below, and the middle management is going, and there are not sufficient appointments are being made at the top. What are the ramifications for diplomacy, and sort of where do you see the future of diplomacy in American foreign policy going forward?
Well, I fervently hope that it remains central to our foreign policy, and I very much fear that certainly it's not now, and it's at great risk. When I think back to just the last few years, I think of a coalition of 65 countries that came together to fight Daesh, to fight ISIL. That didn't happen by itself. That was American diplomacy that brought it together. I think about an international community that was rallied and organized to deal with the outbreak of Ebola. That didn't just happen. That was American diplomacy. I think about a historic accord in Paris to deal with climate change. That didn't happen by accident. That was American diplomacy. I can think of a whole series of things. Peaceful transition of power in Afghanistan, which for all its problems at least had that. Bringing all of Africa's leaders together in one place, in a summit, to engage more deeply with them and to engage them with the private sector. Working with all the countries in the Northern Triangle and Central America to try to deal with crime, violence, drugs that's precipitating migration, but also mostly doing horrific things to these countries. To diplomatic relations with Cuba, to having the head of the Vietnamese Communist Party in the Oval Office of the White House, to the Iran nuclear agreement. I mean, think about that. Cuba, Vietnam, Iran, the three biggest thorns in the side of the United States for generations. As a result of diplomacy, those relationships got better. They didn't resolve all our problems, far from it, but on a better track. And I always like to play a thought experiment. when I think about this. And I think many of you, will remember, or you can't really avoid it, every time just before Christmas comes around, somewhere on TV, the movie It's a Wonderful Life is shown. And for those of you who haven't seen it or don't remember it, basically it's the story of this man played by Jimmy Stewart, George Bailey, who at the beginning of the movie is about to take his own life. He feels like he's let his family down, he's let his community down, he's let his town down. He thinks he's been a failure. And an angel taps him on the shoulder and says, wait, before you do that, I want to show you what life would have looked like if you had not been there, what Bedford Falls, his town, would have looked like. And of course, the alternative universe, if he'd never been born, the town was hell on earth. Well, to me, American diplomacy is a little bit like Jimmy Stewart, like George Bailey in that movie. You take it out of the picture, and as complicated, as difficult, as bad as things are, believe me, they are a lot worse without it. The world is not self-organizing. And if the United States is not in the picture, then one of two things happens. Someone else will do the organizing, and probably in ways that are not advantageous to our interests, and I would argue, not advantageous to our values. Or no one does. You have chaos, and into that vacuum, malevolent forces are most likely to go. So when I see the State Department budget being cut by proposition of the administration by 30%, when I see things like our budget for refugees and migration at a time when we're having the largest migration crisis in the world since the end of World War II, 70 million people displaced from their homes. Put them all in one country, it's the size it's bigger than actually South Korea or Spain, the 24th largest country on earth. HIV/AIDS, one of the great successes, one of the most wonderful achievements of American diplomacy by President George W. Bush through PEPFAR. That budget decimated. When I look at, incredibly, embassy security, that budget decimated. After Benghazi, you've got to be kidding. When I see disaster assistance and food relief being decimated, when I see 2,500 positions of diplomats and development experts being cut, and all of this arbitrarily, that does not argue well for the future of Bedford Falls.
So, yeah, okay. That's right. All right, so with that, let me actually open it to the floor, and if you would introduce yourselves right in the back, a gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Dean Nasser. Thank you, Mr. Blanken, for being here. I'm Chris Barnes. I'm a second-year MA student here, conflict management concentrator, and aspiring diplomat. Foreign service is where I'm hoping to go.
Great.
And I'm wondering, particularly having read that piece from Dr. Cohen in The Atlantic, what you would say to people who are not yet in that field, and what, given the fact that we're not actually there yet, we can do, or at least strive to do, to prevent what you're talking about from happening.
Thank you, and thank you for looking at that as a possible future. My fervent hope would be that you pursue it, and that others of you, maybe even many of you in this room, do it. We need our most talented people from this most talented generation to go into diplomacy, the foreign service, development. And look, administrations come and go. There'll be others. And so I would hope that even if an administration is not particularly sympathetic to or supportive of diplomacy, ones in the future will be. And maybe there'll be a little bit of a pendulum swing. But here's what bothers me so much. I worked in government, Valley, for almost 25 years, starting at the very beginning of the Clinton administration, then working on the Hill, and then back in Obama. And I got to know, over the course of almost 25 years, a lot of foreign service officers and civil servants. I've worked with them for several decades. And every one of them, I'm sure, has political beliefs and views. Maybe they're more Democrats than Republicans. I don't know. What I do know is that virtually all of them, and in my experience, all of them, check whatever those views are at the door of the State Department. And their strongest desire is to support the Secretary of State and the administration they're working for. They want their secretary to succeed. When his or her voice is heard, their voice is heard. And I think some of the administration have made a profound mistake in seeing them as the enemy. They're not. They are among our greatest patriots. And it's a huge disservice to them, but really a disservice to the country, to marginalize them, to push them to the side, to not listen to them, to not trust them. So I really hope that that changes. And, you know, I think there's some positive signs. I mentioned I have a terrific successor, a guy named John Sullivan, who has tremendous respect for, reverence for the Foreign Service, the State Department. That makes a real difference. But, you know, the truth of the matter is, I have talked to a lot of officers who are mid-career. And it's true. A number of them have left. Many others are contemplating leaving. And that's going to have an impact not just today, but in 5 or 10 years when those very strong, smart mid-level officers would be rising to the most senior jobs. We are going to have a hole in the middle of our diplomacy if they don't stay, or if people like you don't go in to take their place. So please give it real consideration, because it remains an extraordinary place. It's an extraordinary pursuit. And if you're willing to make some of the sacrifices that come along with that kind of life, I think the rewards far outweigh them.
This gentleman here.
Thank you so much. Jiawei Li, SAIS graduate from United Nations. My question is in terms of the North Korea. So I'm just wondering how feasible it is for the U.S. to leverage Taiwan to pressure China on the North Korea issue, and how attractive would that deal be to China? Thank you so much.
Oh, I think it's very, in my judgment at least, very ill-advised to mix apples and oranges. So there's been talk about leveraging other things, relationships. You mentioned Taiwan. There was talk about leveraging trade. It's complicated enough. If you start introducing these other elements, I think you actually make the prospects for getting coordination and cooperation, those prospects go down, they don't go up. And you're more likely to precipitate a crisis among countries who should be working together, as opposed to putting genuine, comprehensive, sustained pressure on North Korea. So I'd be very leery of that.
Peter?
Thank you. I'm Peter Botellier. Thank you very much for your presentation. I used to teach here at SAIS on courses on China. I have a question for you on North Korea. Simply, the question is, why did the framework agreement fall apart? In your very first remarks, you talked about some hope that existed in the 90s that the framework agreement would work and that North Korea would join the community of nations and that things would begin to normalize. Why didn't that happen? Is there any truth to the story? I heard from Chinese sources that the US did not deliver on its promise of huge quantities of fuel oil as part of the framework agreement.
My own sense, and it's a really interesting history, and it's interesting to look at in detail. It's a great question, because that is a really interesting inquiry. I think there were a number of factors that went into it. Yes, we were slow in actually delivering on some of the commitments that we'd made in the agreement, including the light water reactors. So that was part of the problem. I do think the larger problem ultimately were two things. One, there was evidence that emerged of a surreptitious uranium program. Now, the agreement on its terms covered plutonium. The North Koreans could argue that they weren't cheating on it, but at least in spirit, they certainly were. And then I think the Bush administration that came in after the Clinton administration took a different approach. And you'll recall North Korea was wrapped into the axis of evil And the combination of all these elements, I think, resulted in the demise of the agreed framework. It's worth looking in detail at your question and kind of trying to assess exactly who was responsible for what. But yes, in fairness, I think there are things that we were obligated to do under the agreement that we were certainly not, arguably, we're not doing, or we're not doing fast enough, and that created suspicions in North Korea. But fundamentally, the North Koreans were also cheating on certainly the spirit of the agreement, if not the letter of it.
Excellent. This young gentleman here.
Hi, hello. My name is Matthew Kim from Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. I actually came back from the Korean military after serving in an artillery force, and I've got to have a first-hand experience of North Korean threat and danger. But as Koreans, we feel sometimes afraid of the relationship with the United States. Because with Trump being president, he talks about how he's going to withdraw troops from South Korea. And also there's a terminology in South Korea called Korea passing, which means that if North Korea shoots nuclear missile, nuclear testing, the United States talk to Japan and China, but not necessarily with South Korea.
Yeah.
What do you think the future of the U.S. and South Korean relationship will be under Trump administration?
Look, there are certainly some disquieting signs. And first of all, thank you for your service, not only to your country, but also to the alliance and to everything we were trying to do together. I don't know where you were deployed. Were you on the DMZ, or where were you? Border. Yeah. Well, anyone who's been there knows that's a challenging assignment. One of the things that is distressing to me is, at least in my biased opinion, when we left office, the relationship with South Korea was as good as it's ever been. We were talking virtually every single day at very senior levels. I was meeting with my South Korean counterpart in person every quarter, every 3 months, and also meeting not only with him, but also with our Japanese counterpart together every 3 months. And then we were on the phone very, very regularly. And at more senior levels, there was that kind of communication and contact, Secretary Kerry and others. And it was our opening proposition that the first thing we had to get right was the alliance with South Korea. That was the foundation. And we wanted to make sure that there was no daylight between our countries. And we worked really hard at that. And sure, there were sometimes differences of opinion and tactical differences, but we were, I think, very much in alignment. And that gives you a tremendous source of strength in dealing with a problem like North Korea. And of course, North Korea's objective is to divide us. So if we ourselves play into those kind of divisions, we're doing North Korea's work for it. It's, I think, the height of strategic folly. So I hope the administration recognizes that. I think you're right. If doubts start to creep in South Korea in particular, but also in Japan, that the United States will make good on its obligations and commitments as an ally, then you'll see, as we've already seen, lots more talk in South Korea about developing its own nuclear deterrent. And far from having a denuclearized peninsula, we'll have a much more robustly nuclearized peninsula, which is in no one's interest. So to me, it all starts with that relationship. My hope is that that reality really does start to govern the thinking here. And yes, look, you know, leaders matter, relationships between leaders matter. Some are better than others. We certainly had our share of relationships that were not as good as others. But when it comes to your fundamental interests, you've got to get over those and figure out ways to work closely together. So I hope the administration focuses on that.
Over here in the front.
Good evening, Mr. Blinken. Thank you very much for the remarks. I'm a student at the Hutchison Public Service Fellowship in Government, so undergraduate. I come from Sciences Po in France. And I would like to ask you a question about North Korea again.
It's a very popular topic this evening.
Don't you think Kim Jong-un wants the nuclear weapon to be heard on the international stage? And so instead of imposing sanctions and more sanctions, why not give him what he wants? I know more important role in the UN, a seat in the Security Council.
Yeah.
And actually, it's a larger question. Why not powerful countries give more room to less powerful countries? Thank you.
Well, I think to take the second part of your question first, which is an excellent one, I think that larger proposition is absolutely necessary. If we're going to sustain the legitimacy of a system that was created after World War II, with certain realities at the time that are no longer the same, in particular the emergence of a number of countries that were not in the position they're in now when the system was created, if we can't accommodate for those kind of changes and developments, then it's going to be hard to sustain the system that's done a lot of good for a lot of people around the world. So I agree with the basic proposition. That said, moving from that basic principle to actually doing it, boy, is that difficult. So Security Council reform, we've been working on that for years. And you know, the veto-wielding powers don't want to give up that authority. Even bringing new countries on a permanent basis onto the Security Council without the veto is very, as you know, very, very controversial. But I believe very much that we have to move in that direction. It's very hard to say to India, for example, maybe Brazil, Japan, I don't know, you can take your pick. That's a difficult proposition. Now, Kim Jong-un's another matter. Because don't forget, we're not only dealing with a leader and a country that has, against the will of the international community, against the norms established by that community, moved full speed ahead with the nuclear and missile program. You're also dealing with one of the most reprehensible regimes in the world when it comes to the treatment of its own people. The idea of giving that kind of regime any kind of legitimized voice is a very, very hard pill to swallow. And indeed, as we've been dealing with the nuclear issue in North Korea for many, many years, a little bit like Iran, some people have said, even when we did the agreed framework, well, you didn't deal with all the other terrible things that North Korea is doing. Well, one thing at a time. If we could at least deal with the nuclear problem, that might make it a little bit easier to deal with some of the other problems. That said, yes, I think there is something right about the proposition you put on the table, which was, besides seeing the nuclear program as an insurance policy, I think you're right. I do think that Kim Jong-un sees it as his card to put on the table to be accepted, maybe accepted is the wrong word, acknowledged as a part of the international community and something that's not going away. There are ways to accommodate that. For example, we've said, and in an agreement that was reached in 2005 among the countries that were trying to negotiate with North Korea and North Korea, there was an agreement reached that if North Korea dealt in a legitimate way with the nuclear problem and the missile program, we would be prepared to engage with it on talks that led to the conclusion of a peace treaty to replace the armistice. So we put that on the table. We all signed up to it. I believe we should remain committed to that. I think you can get to a better place in the overall relationship with North Korea, even as you have to hold your nose at the abhorrent behavior of the regime at home. The stories that come out of North Korea, I think are, you know, it's hard to compare relatively bad things that happen in different parts of the world, but North Korea is definitely getting the gold medal in the way it abominably treats its own people. So but there is a way, I think, to answer the basic concern that we are not about regime change. At the end of the day, though, North Korea's entire rationale for being is to maintain antagonism with South Korea and to maintain antagonism with us. If that goes away, it's very hard to legitimize to its own people what the regime is doing. So it makes it very complicated to deal with.
This lady here.
I'm Clara Bilgin from Virginia International University, and I do election observation with OSCE, and I travel a lot around 47 countries in Eastern Central Europe, observing their political processes. And in the last year, what I saw is a big retrenchment of our diplomacy in places like Albania, Macedonia, you know, Bulgaria, and these are critical places. We fought for the last 25 years to bring them to our orbit, and I would just let them go through our fingers, yes? So I would like to hear what would be your comment on this. And my second question is, in terms of us being a global citizen, you mentioned a little bit about our refugee policy. But there is another one that I get a lot of questions from people abroad, and this is our diversity lottery. And it seems that by having this diversity lottery, we have created a lot of goodwill and investment of people who hope that after applying for 15, 20 years, they may end up coming here just by pure chance, or possibly their children. And it has always amazed me how by having this diversity lottery, we make millions of people have an investment in the well-being of this country. And when we say, okay, let's just cut it off, we never think about these invisible ties. They tie them to us. And that if we tell them, you can never be part of us, this means basically we would immediately antagonize them on the spot and lose millions that would have previously goodwill just to have badwill.
You make a very, very powerful point. I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that I find amazing is, on one level, and of course there are other reasons understandable which we can get into, but it's pretty extraordinary when you are the one country on earth that more people want to come to than any other, that you find that a bad thing. That is maybe the greatest evidence of the success of the United States. So the idea that we would turn our backs on that, I find at a very basic level incomprehensible. I also find it incomprehensible because, as we all know, if you're not a Native American, you're an immigrant to this country at some point in your family's past. And maybe it was last year, maybe it was last century, but you're an immigrant. And you know as well that every successive wave of immigrants, whether they were Irish, Italian, Asian, Jewish, Latino, have built this country with their hands and with their heads. And when we look across the spectrum of activities today, the low end, who is picking our crops, serving our food, cleaning our rooms? Immigrants. Who are nursing the sick, doctoring underserved communities where there are no American doctors? Immigrants. And then at the higher end of the spectrum, who are the founders of the Fortune 500 companies? Well, 40% immigrants or the children of immigrants. Who are the founders of the 50% of the top companies in Silicon Valley? Immigrants. To turn our backs, to shut the door, is profoundly, profoundly antithetical, common sense, but also to decency and who we are, I think, as Americans. So I think, but the point you make is a very powerful one about the lottery, and I think you're exactly right. It has sent a message of goodwill. It has created an investment in this country, and hopes and dreams, and that's being shattered. So I despair, maybe more than anything else, at that. At the same time, I think we need to understand something, and it's this. When you look at what's dividing us here and what's dividing so many people in other countries, notably in Europe, this division is not between left and right, or in our parlance, Republican and Democrat, conservative or liberal. It is, at least in my judgment, a division between those of us who believe that, faced with these incredibly complicated forces of change, what we need to do is protect ourselves, defend ourselves, disconnect, versus those of us who believe that, no, the best thing to do is to remain open and connected, but to try to shape these forces of change to the best of our ability to our advantage or mitigate their downsides. And it's kind of understandable why this is all happening. On the one hand, things are changing so quickly with technology, the unbridled flow of information, the erosion of borders, that creates among a lot of people a sense of chaos and confusion and vulnerability. Then you have the fact that in the aggregate, there's been more human progress over the last 50 or 70 years than at any time in human history. Overall, people are healthier, wealthier, wiser, more secure, even more tolerant than they've ever been. And yet, that progress is not evenly distributed. And so that creates anger, fear, and resentment to go with the sense of chaos, confusion, and vulnerability. And then you have these big power shifts, not only among countries, we were talking about that, but also new actors. Head of a corporation, mayor of a big city, some kind of super empowered group or individual, all of whom now have much greater power to prevent traditional sources of authority, a government, an international institution, from getting a result. They can veto outcomes. That creates a crisis of legitimacy in traditional sources of authority. You put all of that together, and it's like a perfect storm in which the response becomes nationalism and populism. And it's very easy then to turn an immigrant into a threat to your identity, a refugee into a threat to your security, a trade deal into a threat to your job, an alliance, an international organization, into a deadweight on resources that should be better spent at home. That, to me, is the bigger environment we're operating in. Unless we understand that and do a better job in reaching people who genuinely feel, and in some cases genuinely are, left out and left behind, then we have a much bigger problem. And I think the immigration piece plays into that. On the first part of your question, just very quickly, you know the old expression, 90% of life is showing up. We need to keep showing up. Our diplomats need to keep being present. We need to keep, figuratively speaking, flying the American flag, because I think just that presence is a huge comfort to people in countries that are in conflict or are being disputed by our Russian friends.
Well, with that, I mean, this was a rich conversation and a very powerful case for the importance of diplomacy in our foreign policy. Thank you very much for this conversation. Please join me in thanking Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.